And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Hamza Youssef.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As members will be aware, the Lord Advocate met with the family of Sheku Bayoh yesterday to inform them of the outcome of the victim's right to review process in connection with the circumstances of Mr Bayoh's tragic death in 2015. Mr Bayoh died in the course of an operation by police officers to restrain him, and I know the thoughts of members across the Chamber will be with his family and friends at this difficult time. Following what has been a complex and thorough investigation and review, the Lord Advocate has confirmed that on the basis of the evidence available, there will be no criminal proceedings against Police Scotland or individual police officers in connection with Mr Bayoh's death. The First Minister and I met with the family today to express our deepest condolences and assure them of our commitment to establishing the facts surrounding this tragic incident. They are right to expect a full public examination of the circumstances of Mr Bayoh's death, and I stated my determination to put in place a process to deliver that. Today, I can confirm I will establish a statutory public inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005 into the circumstances leading up to and, crucially, following Mr Bayoh's death. Indeed, all deaths in police custody are subject to a mandatory fatal accident inquiry under the Fatal Accident and Sudden Deaths, etc. Scotland Act 2016. The responsibility for establishing the FAI sits with the Procurator Fiscal under the direction of Lord Advocate. FAIs examine the cause of death and consider steps to prevent other deaths in similar circumstances. In this case, however, the Lord Advocate, as head of the system for the investigations of death in Scotland, considers the remit of an FAI would not allow all the issues which require to be investigated to be addressed. FAIs can examine circumstances and factors leading up to a death, but not what follows after. And in this case, the Lord Advocate has identified questions raising issues of public interest and importance about the early stages of the post-incident management of the investigation that an FAI simply could not examine. That being the case, it is imperative that the circumstances leading up to Mr Bayoh's death and the events that followed are examined in full and in public. I'm conscious that public inquiries are significant undertakings, and this is not a decision to be made in haste. As members will be aware, Mr Bayoh's family have been calling for a public inquiry for a number of years, and the First Minister made clear it was definitely an option. When I met the family last year, I assured them that this government shared the family's commitment to getting answers. On that basis, it is one option I've been considering in advance of the confirmation yesterday of the Lord Advocate's decision, not to preempt that decision, but to be prepared for this outcome. Now that we have confirmation that there will be no criminal proceedings in this case, and having examined all other options, I believe that as a government, it is right that we should hold a public inquiry. I have discussed this with Mr Bayoh's family, honouring my commitment to update them first. They were very clear in their determination to get to the facts surrounding Mr Bayoh's tragic death, and a public inquiry is now the surest way to do this. The terms of reference of the public inquiry will determine the scope, the direction and parameters of the inquiry. So it will be important to take time to get them right. It will cover matters which will be covered by an FAI and also a range of other issues, such as the post-incident management of the investigation. The formulation of the terms of reference will require discussion with the person appointed to chair the inquiry, and I'll also wish to discuss the draft terms of reference with those most directly affected by the inquiry, with a view to shaping a remit that's clearly focused. We must not lose sight of the purpose of this inquiry: to establish the circumstances leading to and following the tragic death of Mr Bayoh, in order to identify any steps which could prevent deaths in similar circumstances, and to improve the post-incident management following such deaths. Let me be clear, Presiding Officer, for any independent scrutiny of this case to be rigorous and credible, it must address the question of whether or not Mr Bayoh's race played a part in how the incident was approached and dealt with by the police. In saying that, I am not prejudging the answer to that question, That will be for the inquiry, which will be independent of ministers. In order to do this effectively, the inquiry must be equipped with the necessary diversity of expertise and backgrounds to scrutinise the extent to which race was a factor in this case. I will be discussing how we can build diversity into the structures of this inquiry with the Chair, who will be instrumental in helping to shape the terms of reference. The formal process directed to appointing a Chair will begin shortly, and it will be important to ensure the Chair will command the confidence of those involved and indeed of the wider public. This will include ensuring an appropriate level of expertise and taking forward the remit of the inquiry. This too will take time, but I will return to the Chamber to provide a full statement confirming the inquiry's terms of reference and the Chair early next year. If systemic issues emerge that were causal or contributory factors in this case, then it is right that the inquiry addresses these. While we must be careful not to expand the terms of reference beyond its core purpose, not least to avoid further delaying the process for all involved, it's important that all relevant issues are covered. However, it is not intended that this inquiry will consider the wider framework for investigations into serious incidents involving the police, given that, as members will be aware, Dame Alicia Angelini is currently reviewing law and practice for complaint handling, investigations and misconduct in relation to policing. There may be areas of shared interest between the review and this public inquiry, but Dame Angelini's review is not investigating individual cases, whereas the primary purpose of this inquiry will be to examine the circumstances of this specific case. I am, of course, aware of other families who have lost loved ones in tragic circumstances and are looking for answers. My thoughts and those of colleagues in the Chamber remain with those families. In a number of cases, complex investigations are still underway, while others may have been subject to other processes, including the FAI process. Each of these cases will have its own distinct features, and it is important to allow these processes to run their course. As I set out in my letter to the Justice Committee last week, I recognise there are questions about the arrangements within the SPS and NHS for handling deaths and prison custody. That is why I've asked Her Majesty's Chief Inspectorate of Prisons to undertake a review into the handling of deaths in prison custody. In addition to HMC IPS, I've asked Professor Nancy Laux of Families Outside to work alongside and provide external expertise. The review will have a sharp human rights focus and ensure the voices of families of those in prison is heard. But turning back to Policing Presiding Officer, it is worth noting that since the establishment of Police Scotland, public scrutiny of policing has never been greater, and understandably so. It is essential that public and parliamentary confidence in the police remains strong, and I know members will share my view that police officers and staff across Scotland work hard to keep us all safe. The 2018-19 annual report by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary in Scotland stated that, and I quote, "We continue to be impressed by the determination of officers and staff to delivering an effective policing to the communities they serve. We know the majority of adults also said police were doing a good or excellent job in their local area. As a government, we remain committed to excellence in policing, and our commitment to protect Scotland's police revenue budget has seen their annual budget increase by more than 80 million since 2016-17. But of course, policing by consent depends upon accountability, and it is vital that the police are held to account when things go wrong. I know, having spoken to the Chief Constable regularly, that he also values this accountability. I'm clear that a public inquiry will provide the independent and robust mechanism needed to give us that clear understanding. As with all statutory inquiries, it will be inquisitorial rather than adversarial. It will also identify lessons and improvement for the future to help prevent deaths in similar circumstances and build trust and confidence in policing. Let me finish, Presiding Officer, by expressing my condolences once again to Mr Bayoh's family and friends who have been unwavering in their search for answers. I am confident that a statutory public inquiry under the 2005 Act will provide the best means of establishing the circumstances leading to and following Mr Bayoh's tragic death.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. Call Liam Kerr to be followed by James Kelly. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Firstly, I would like to associate myself and this party with the Cabinet Secretary's expression of deepest condolences to the family of Mr Bayoh and understand their need for a full public examination of the circumstances of Mr Bayoh's death to establish the facts. We are therefore pleased that the Cabinet Secretary will establish a public inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005 into those circumstances and identify lessons and improvements. A number of questions arise from the Cabinet Secretary's statement. Firstly, this tragic incident took place in 2015. Therefore, it's taken 4 years to get to this point. Given that, can the Cabinet Secretary give any more indication as to the timescales that will be involved in setting up and conducting the public inquiry, and any indication of when it might report? Secondly, is the Cabinet Secretary able to advise what kind of inquiry this will be and the level of it? Specifically, will it be judge-led? And finally, is the Cabinet Secretary able to give us any further detail as to why a fatal accident inquiry was not felt to be appropriate, and specifically the questions identified by the Lord Advocate?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Liam Kerr for those important questions and the tone in which he asked them. I agree with him that there has been a long search for answers from the family of Mr Bayoh. I can't comment too much on the reasons for those delays, as Liam Kerr will be absolutely aware. The examination and investigation into whether or not there was to be criminal proceedings would be one, and was one, conducted independently by the Crown, with no rightly ministerial influence into that. So the reasons for that length of time are really for the Crown to answer, and I'm sure they would have been certainly part of the conversation that took place between Lord Advocate and the Bayoh family yesterday. But in saying that, there is a balance to be struck between ensuring that the public inquiry forensically examines not just the specific instance here, an incident that we are discussing and referring to, the tragic death of Mr Bayoh, but also, of course, it can look at further systemic or potentially systemic issues, but not being so wide that it loses focus and therefore, of course, exacerbates that challenge, that difficulty, that hurt that the family has felt because of the timescale it has taken to get to this point. So there'll be a fine balance to get, and that will be part of the discussion about the remit, which I will have with stakeholders that have an interest in this, as well, of course, with the chair of the inquiry. In terms of his question around it being judge-led, again, he'll forgive me, we will take some time to have a discussion with stakeholders, and I should say I welcome any conversations with members of the opposition also. What I tried to say in my statement, it will be really important that, as well as having a chair, having the appropriate expertise, particularly on issues around race and diversity, are going to be hugely important to be built in. And we've seen that in some inquiries down south, for example, when I think about the McPherson inquiry. We've also seen where that hasn't been done correctly. There was often criticism of the inquiry into Grenfell because of that lack of diversity, considering the tragedy and the victims that were involved in some of that. So we want to make sure we learn lessons of inquiries, both that have taken place in Scotland and in other parts of the UK. In terms of the FAI question that Liam Kerr asked, which again is a very pertinent and important one, the Lord Advocate has said, and I should say he's happy for me to say this on the record, that's why it's in my statement. He doesn't give me this advice as law officers, of course we wouldn't disclose law officer advice, but in his remit as the head of investigations into deaths, he says very clearly that the FAI would not be able to examine the post-incident management of the tragic death of Mr Bayoh, and I think for anybody objectively looking at that case, there are questions that have to be answered, not just in the lead-up to Mr Bayoh's death, but absolutely the follow-on and the post-incident management of that. And FAI simply would not cover that, and therefore a public inquiry under the Public Inquiries Act 2005, I think is the absolute right decision to make in this case.
James Kelly, to be followed by John Finney. James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement, and also offer my deepest sympathies to Mr Bayoh's family. It is shocking in modern Scotland the circumstances in which Mr Bayoh has lost his life, and it's unacceptable that nobody has been held legally responsible from that point of view, I strongly support the Cabinet Secretary's announcement today that there will be a public inquiry. There is a concern in this case and other cases about the lack of transparency around the Lord Advocate's decisions on non-prosecution and the granting of immunity for police officers and prison officers. Can I therefore ask the Cabinet Secretary if the public inquiry will examine recent cases and review the protocol the Lord Advocate follows in reaching a decision for non-prosecution or granting of immunity from police or prison officers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank James Kelly for the question? It's an important one, but also a very difficult question, because he knows as well as I do, and for very good reason, the importance of the independence of the Lord Advocate. That, of course, doesn't translate into not being accountable. Our judiciary, our Crown, of course, while independent of government and independent of parliamentarians, that does not mean that they are not accountable for those decisions. The Lord Advocate himself, of course, is and has been on occasion, of course, answerable to this Parliament, answering questions in the very spot that I am standing in. In terms of any decision for immunity, again, I hope James Kelly will understand why I'm answering this way, but that would, of course, be a question for the Lord Advocate and for the Crown. It would be absolutely unacceptable for the Justice Secretary to make a decision on who should receive immunity from prosecution or not in a whole range of cases, and I think James Kelly would understand that. Equally, let me say that I would understand James Kelly's and other people's frustration if the government and I have chosen to set up a public inquiry, if those that attended that public inquiry were not giving full and frank answers. So there is a decision for the Lord Advocate to make in respect to immunity. In terms of other cases, this public inquiry is specifically looking at the Sheku Bayoh case, and it will focus on that case. It will look at some of the systemic issues around that, and some of those systemic issues around that, if they are raised, they may well be relevant to other cases that have gone by previously. But of course, the focus on this case will be for the very unique circumstances involved in it, be on the tragic incident that took place involving Mr. Bayoh.
John Finney, to be followed by Liam MacArthur. John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as with others in the Chamber, our thoughts are with Mr Bayoh's family and friends. And thank you to the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of that statement. Can I push a bit further on Mr Kelly's question to the Cabinet Secretary? Because whilst it's entirely appropriate that the decision regarding criminal immunity is a matter for the Lord Advocate, can you tell the Chamber whether anyone has been granted criminal immunity in respect of any future inquiry? And can you outline whether such an inquiry would have powers to compel witnesses to attend, I think particularly of perhaps former police officers, including ex-Chief Constable Stephen House?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, I can't add too much more than what I said to James Kelly's. It would be for the Lord Advocate. I don't think a determination has been made, I should say, but I caveat that with saying that is my understanding thus far. But any decision on immunity in the future will be absolutely for Lord Advocate, and so he would be answerable for a decision on that. In terms of compelling witnesses, it's absolutely my understanding that under the Inquiries Act 2005, the witnesses can be compelled not complying with an instruction from the chair of the inquiry could lead to some offences being committed. So that is why I think a public inquiry under the 2005 Act, with all the powers that grants a chair and an inquiry, I think is the absolute right way to proceed.
Liam MacArthur, to be followed by David Torrance.
Thank you. Can I start by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement? Very much welcome the announcement in relation to the inquiry, and extend my condolences to family and friends of Sheku Bayoh, a family that has been left looking for answers for the past 4 years. At the same time, police officers have been left in limbo, and I think, as the Cabinet Secretary acknowledged, the public is potentially less safe as a result of lessons not having been learned. Following on the questions from James Kelly, I appreciate the sensitivities around this, but 4 years is surely far too long to wait. Can we not look at ways in which this system can be speeded up, can be made more efficient, so that other families are not put through the same sort of trauma as the Sheku Bayoh family has undoubtedly been put through over the last 4 years?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Lee MacArthur for his question? Can I again reiterate how much I admire the family of Sheku Bayoh. You know, 4.5 years after such a tragic incident and having faced a number of obstacles, difficulties, hurdles, they have been unwavering in their search for answers into what happened and the follow-on after Sheku's death. Sheku's mother lives 3,500 miles away in Freetown in Sierra Leone. She's here today. She's often come to Scotland to be with her family. And I can see from meeting her today that she's a rock of that family to make sure that she gets the answers to the questions of why she lost her son and what on earth happened in the aftermath of that. So can I restate and join Lee MacArthur in his admiration for the Bayoh family. In terms of the substance of his question, again, I know Lee MacArthur has often pressed on this point, and he's right to do so, that I agree with him, that 4.5 years is a long time to wait for answers. I know that there are questions around the delays and FAIs as well. What I can do is give some reassurance. Again, this is very much in the remit of the Lord Advocate. The officials, members of the Parliament may be aware that the Lord Advocate has said very publicly that he is looking at ways to reduce that delay. He has been reviewing the reasons for that delay, and he understands the frustration of families around and surrounding that delay. So I have to be, of course, sensitive and rightly sensitive to the fact that this is very much in the domain of the independent Lord Advocate. But it's fair to say he is not unaware of the frustration that delay can cause and any ways to minimise that. Certainly, if government can do anything, then I would be supportive of that.
Thank you. David Torrance, to be followed by Margaret Mitchell. David Torrance.
As MSP for Kirkcaldy, can I once again express my condolences to Mr Bayoh's family and friends, who we can all agree have been unwavering in their search for answers. There has been much speculation around this tragic incident, and the establishment of a statutory public inquiry is the best means of establishing the circumstances leading to and following Mr Bayoh's death. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree we must now allow the forthcoming inquiry to do its job?
Secretary.
Well, I think this is a crucial point made by David Torrance. There have been a number of questions that have, of course, remain unanswered, hence the reason for the public inquiry. But I'm afraid sometimes in that vacuum, there have been really quite, I would say, insensitive is the nicest word I could possibly use, insensitive accusations and, frankly, sometimes smears that have been thrown and bandied around. I think that is not just deeply unhelpful, but I can imagine incredibly hurtful as well for the family involved. You know, Sheku was roughly my age. He was a Muslim, much like me. He was a minority living in Scotland, much like I am. And, you know, there are some really fundamental questions that have to be asked around not just the events leading up to his death, but frankly, some of the processes that took place afterwards. And I, as Justice Secretary, want to have absolute confidence in the processes that exist in the justice system that I preside over to ensure that if, you know, hopefully we can prevent a death like this ever happening again. But if it ever did tragically happen again, that I have absolute confidence in the processes that follow on. So David Torrance is right. For all those involved, for all the stakeholders, but of course emotions are high, no doubt with the family, but also, of course, I don't doubt for the police and for officers involved, that actually maybe there needs to be, everybody needs to understand that at the heart of this is a man who lost his life and a family who are devastated by that. So everybody should let the inquiry, frankly, do the job that the inquiry is meant to do, and that is to get to the truth and answer the questions that remain at this moment in time unanswered.
Margaret Mitchell, to be followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Presiding Officer, I too extend my condolences to the family and friends of Mr Bayoh. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm if there is a mechanism to establish how often a decision has been taken not to prosecute where someone has died in either police or prison custody, and where concerns have been expressed about the action or conduct of either Police Scotland or individual police officers, or SPS or individual prison officers? And does he agree that this information is vitally important to establish openness and transparency in these tragic circumstances.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say to Margaret Mitchell that the many times I've appeared in front of her committee, I know her commitment and I hope she knows mine to transparency right throughout the justice system. So anything that we can do around that transparency, I think, is crucially important. Again, I reiterate, and I know she understands this, that the decisions to prosecute or not to prosecute, the decisions to effectively give immunity or not, are ones very much for the independent Lord Advocate, and none of us, be it government or opposition politicians, should have a say in that or seek to influence that unduly. In terms of the substance of her question around the data, around how many individuals who have been in these circumstances or similar circumstances around deaths in custody, be they in police or prison, being prosecuted or not, I will take that away. And as a result of her question, I will explore whether or not that data exists with the Crown and whether there's something more that we can do, because we should not, and we do not, and I certainly do not fear anything from additional transparency.
Jenny Gilruth to be followed by Claire Baker. Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I add my condolences to Mr Bayoh's family. Whilst we must not prejudge the answer to the question of whether or not Mr Bayoh's race played a part in how the incident was dealt with by the police, for any independent scrutiny of this case to be rigorous and credible, it must address that very question. Can the Cabinet Secretary therefore confirm the intention for this inquiry to be equipped with the necessary diversity of both expertise and background?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, I do, and I wish to restate and re-emphasise that very point, that we cannot simply remove the issue of race from this very pertinent question. Race is undoubtedly a question that has to be answered. I don't prejudge that, but we have to allow a chair, a public inquiry, an independent public inquiry, to investigate whether or not, and to determine whether or not race played a part, any part, in how this incident was dealt with by police. And the point that Jenny Gilruth makes is hugely important, that in order to gain the confidence of our communities, of the family of Mr Bayoh, but I would hope the public at large, it is vitally important that the structures within any public inquiry of this nature, and of this one in particular, reflect the expertise that we'd expect it to when that question is being examined, and to ensure that it reflects the diversity of our communities. So I will explore how to do that. There are some examples of public inquiries, largely from England and Wales, that have managed to factor in that expertise. And I will have a closer look on how to do that. And as I say, I will report back to this Parliament, hopefully early next year.
Claire Baker to be followed by Rona Mackay. Claire Baker.
Presiding Officer, I met the family of Sheku Bayoh days after his death, and it was one of the most affecting meetings I've ever had as an MSP. I have seen them display fortitude and resilience over the past 4.5 years, and their loss deserves answers and for the truth to come out. And the Cabinet Secretary has today made the right decision, and I very much welcome it. It is vital that the public inquiry has the confidence of the family. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain what is intended when he says in the statement he will discuss draft terms of reference with those most directly affected by the inquiry? Can I ask who this will include, or if that's a direct reference to the family?
Cabinet Secretary.
The short answer is yes to that. Claire Baker will also be aware that, of course, there'll be other interested parties as well. I've not had a request from the likes of the Federation, the Police Federation, for example. But of course, it may well come, and therefore, of course, in any inquiry, it's important to give confidence to the independence and the impartiality of that inquiry, that where those requests from interested and relevant stakeholders come in, then I will give them absolute due consideration. But she can take it absolutely from my answer that part of that discussion would be absolutely with the family and indeed the legal representatives of Mr Bayoh. Can I also again join her in once again saluting the fortitude and the dignity actually that the Bayoh family have shown. Can I also thank Claire Baker, who I know has stood by the family and their calls for a public inquiry for many, many years.
Rona Mackay to be followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary is aware there are other families who have lost loved ones in tragic circumstances and are looking for answers. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that each of these cases have their own distinct features, with a number of complex investigations still taking place, and that it is important to allow those processes to run their individual courses?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think that is an important point for anybody who's lost a loved one, be it in prison or indeed in police custody or care. Then I can completely understand their desire for a full, frank investigation and inquiry into that tragic death. But Ronald Mackay is right. Every incident is very unique and individual to that circumstance. And there are a range of processes that can take place. Some incidents and tragic deaths that have been referenced in this chamber on previous occasions have gone through the process of a court trial, some through the process of an FAI. Some are still being determined by the Lord Advocate on whether there should be an FAI or not. But I think it's important to absolutely understand where each individual family comes from. We should empathise absolutely with that. But I think in this circumstance, for all the reasons I've outlined, and I won't rehearse again, that an FAI simply would not be adequate. And therefore, that's why I've instructed a public inquiry under the 2005 Act.
Donald Cameron, to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I return to the issue of time, which many others have already raised? It is over 4.5 years since the death of Mr. Bayoh, a very long time on any view for a family to wait for answers. Setting aside the delays so far and looking to the future, can the Cabinet Secretary reassure this chamber that the inquiry will be set up as quickly as practicable, though plainly not cutting corners in terms of the thoroughness of its investigations?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I can. And Donald Cameron, in his question, very eloquently articulates what the challenge will be. The challenge will be to ensure that there is not any unnecessary delay, because the family have frankly suffered enough, and I'm certain other stakeholders that have an interest in this will want the inquiry to take place underway quickly. At the same time, there will be a need to ensure that we're thorough. I think this will be a public inquiry, frankly, unlike any other public inquiry we've had in Scotland. And again, in relation to the questions that will be asked, the need to build in either a panel or special advisors, but I think probably a panel of expertise to inform a chair and to sit alongside a chair to ensure that all the questions that need to be answered are indeed answered. So what I don't want to do is at this stage commit to what that remit will look like. I'll take some time, not unnecessary time, but I'll take some time to have a conversation with the stakeholders around remit. And it'll be a challenge, but one that I'm sure we will be up to ensure that the remit is focused, but yet it's not so unwieldy, but addresses still systemic issues, and getting that challenge is going to be important. But clearly, whatever remit is decided upon will have an effect on the timescales involved of any public inquiry. So I can give him an absolute assurance there will be no unnecessary delay from our part in government. But equally, I hope members will understand, I'm sure they do, that these things do take a bit of time to make sure we get right.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Anas Harwer. Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I place on record my condolences to the family as well? The Cabinet Secretary spoke about identifying a chair. Can he just confirm for the Chamber and those listening the timeframe he has in mind as to identifying a chair and any support for them, and when he will report back to the Parliament when those developments are known?
Cabinet Secretary.
I should be able to, my hope would be to come back to this Parliament early next year, and the earlier, frankly, the better. But obviously, again, as these things tend to be, the processes for these things can sometimes take time, but also are not entirely my gift. If we do want a judge to be leading this inquiry, then of course that would necessitate a conversation with the Lord President, who would then of course need to speak to senators and make a judgment on who is available, and then that individual would have to of course agree to lead that inquiry, and indeed the fact that we wish to build an expertise would have to be something that they would accept as well. So, I'm hoping we can get that done sooner rather than later. There's only a limited amount of work that I've been able to do in advance of this because although I've planned for this outcome as well as for the outcome, the other outcome, of course, we could not do much more than just simply prepare and plan because we had to wait for the Lord Advocate to make a decision in relation to any further criminal proceedings. So some of this is in my gift, and what is in my gift I will try to do as quickly as I possibly can so there are not any further delays for the Bayoh family who have suffered enough.
Anna Sarwar to be followed by James Dornan. Anna Sarwar.
President Officer, my thoughts are with the family and friends of Sheku Bayoh, and I must also recognise the efforts of their legal team, in particular Amar Anwar, who has relentlessly pursued this case. I also welcome and thank the Cabinet Secretary for the announcement of a public inquiry today. While he's right to say that we can't definitively say that race was a factor in this case, there is no doubt that there is structural racism in Scotland. If we are to build confidence between our communities, the tone is also really important. Will you therefore take the opportunity to make comment on the rather juvenile attempts by the President of the Scottish Police Federation in relation to this case? I understand that the President will want to represent his members and defend his members. That is, of course, his right. But at the same time, that can't be allowed to undermine the confidence in this case, to undermine the feelings of the Bayoh family, or indeed of ethnic minority officers within the police who may also have challenges around structural race issues.
Cabinet Secretary.
Anas, as always, on these issues speaks with a lot of authority, but also articulates the problem and the issues, the sensitivities of this case, I think, very, very well. There's not much for me to add to what he's already said. I think at the heart of this, we must never forget that there is a man, not much difference in age to Anas and I. He was a Muslim, like Anas and I. He was a minority living in Scotland, like Anas and I, who lost his life. And like Anas and I, he has a loving family who obviously have been fighting on his behalf ever since. But at the heart of this, yes, there are other stakeholders, of course, and there have been challenges, no doubt, that those stakeholders have also faced. But at the heart of it, somebody has lost their life. So anybody attempting to dehumanise that, anybody attempting to smear, anybody attempting to downplay the seriousness of this needs to take a very, very long, hard look at themselves in the mirror and think twice about what they're doing. So I would associate myself with the remarks, and I would ask all of those involved. Of course, emotions run high. Of course, people are angry. Of course, people are frustrated. But it is important for the memory of Sheku Bayoh, if nothing else, that people conduct themselves in a way that is worthy of such a cause and let the inquiry, the independent public inquiry, do its job.
And James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following confirmation there will be no criminal proceedings in this case, it is right the Government's holding a public inquiry to get to the facts surrounding Mr Bayoh's tragic death. And just following on from the comments that Mr Sarwar just made there, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the onus is now on all of us, not just those in the Chamber, but those online, to approach this with the sensitivity and respect it deserves, and that that is the least that Mr Bayoh's family is entitled to from all of us?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do believe that for all the reasons I've just outlined in my question previous. But he's absolutely right, James Dornan, to also mention parliamentarians in that. Because again, parliamentarians will have a view, I'm sure, themselves of what happened. They will have watched documentaries. They will have read newspaper reports. They may have received briefing from all different relevant stakeholders, from the legal representatives, and so on and so forth. But it is really important that nothing is said to prejudice the independent inquiry, and that we allow an independent inquiry to do the job that it is meant to do. And so I'd ask all colleagues, and I include myself very much in this, that they show not just an element of consideration, but also be mindful of the fact that we're going to be entering into the inquiry stage. And of course, on that, I'll ensure that we keep the Parliament updated on the next steps moving forward, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, and I would thank the Cabinet Secretary and all the members for their contributions. That concludes this item of business. We're going to move on shortly to the next item.